Somewhere in the archives of a city that has since changed its name, on a shelf that no one dusts anymore, there lies a roll of vellum tied with a faded ribbon. It is a map, partially finished, partially dreamed, of a country that was erased not by war alone, but by the slow, indifferent turning of history. The borders it traces no longer appear in any atlas. The towns it names have been renamed, absorbed, forgotten, and yet someone spent years of their life drawing it, measuring it, believing it was worth preserving, even as the world it depicted quietly ceased to exist. For centuries, the great cartographers of Europe did not merely record the world. They interpreted it. They stood at the edges of known territories with instruments made of brass and patience, translating mountains and rivers into lines of ink so precise that kings would base their decisions upon them. To make a map was to assert that a place was real, that it mattered, that it deserved to be remembered. And so when a master cartographer devoted the last years of his life to mapping a land already dissolving at its edges, already losing its name, its government, its very identity to the pressures of empires larger than itself, that act was not merely geographic. It was an act of grief, a quiet, painstaking refusal to let something vanish without record. When the master died, he left the map unfinished. He left it to the one person who had sat beside him through years of quiet work, an apprentice who had learned to read coastlines like sentences, and to understand that a blank space on a map is never truly empty, only waiting. The apprentice inherited not just the vellum and the ink, but the question the master had never answered, whether it is possible to preserve a place that no longer exists, whether a careful hand and a steady lamp are enough to hold back the erasure of time. What followed was a journey, slow, deliberate, made on foot and by river barge, through landscapes that carried the old names like a secret. A journey to complete something that perhaps could never truly be completed. This is that story. It belongs to the quiet hours, to the space between waking and sleep, to the kind of night when the wind is low, and the room is warm, and the world outside feels very far away. The candle is already burning, the map is already open on the table, and the story, like all the best ones, begins not with a single dramatic moment, but with a door, gently opened, and the soft smell of old paper drifting into the morning air. Tonight we'll walk slowly through the story of this map, and of the two people most responsible for its existence, the master who began it, and the apprentice who inherited it. We will not rush. There is no reason to rush. The candle is steady, the room is warm, and the story has been waiting quietly on this table for a very long time, patient as the stone waits at the corners of the vellum. Settle in, if you haven't already. Let the weight of the day begin to lift from your shoulders. Very slowly, the way mist lifts from a river in the early morning. Not all at once, but gradually, in soft rising tendrils that dissolve before you can quite focus on them. The map, you see, is not simply a geographic document. It is also a kind of letter. A letter written not in words, but in coastlines and contour lines, in the careful placement of a symbol for a monastery on a hillside. In the particular way, the road between two cities curves slightly west to avoid a marsh that has since been drained and built over and forgotten. Every mark on it was made by someone who had been to that place, or who had spoken at length with someone who had, or who had read the accounts of travelers who passed through an earlier century, and whose journals still existed at the time of the map's making, in collections that may themselves now be lost. Each line is a kind of memory, and the empty southeastern quarter, the part that was never filled in, is a kind of silence. The silence of things that were known but never written down, or written down in documents that did not survive, or that were simply left for later, for a quieter moment, for a morning that never quite arrived. If your eyes are already heavy, that is exactly the right place to be. There is nothing you need to do with this story, but let it move around you, the way the candlelight moves around the room, touching the edges of things, softening the corners, making everything It reaches, look a little warmer, a little further from the concerns of the ordinary world. The map on the table is not going anywhere. The story is in no hurry, and the room, small and low-ceilinged, and smelling of old paper and the faintest trace of beeswax from the candle, is entirely content to hold you here for as long as you need. We will begin, as all the best stories about maps must begin, not with the map itself, but with the world that made it necessary. The centuries of craft and patience and slow, painstaking observation that produced the extraordinary tradition of cartography from which this particular document emerged. And we will begin, as all the best stories about people must begin, not with a dramatic moment, but with something quieter and more fundamental. A room, a table, a candle, and two people sitting together in the companionable silence of shared work, one teaching and one learning, both of them engaged in the ancient and deeply human act of trying to understand, with ink and patience and careful attention, the shape of the world they inhabited. The candle is low and steady, the room is quiet and still, and the story, unhurried as the river on the map, is already beginning to move. To make a map, in the centuries before photography and before the precise instruments of modern surveying, was to undertake an act of extraordinary patience. It was not a task that could be hurried. It could not be accomplished in a single journey, or by a single person, or in a single season. It required years, sometimes decades, of accumulated observation, of letters exchanged between scholars in different cities, of measurements taken at dawn when the light was clearest, and the shadows fell at their most revealing angles. It required a particular kind of person, someone who could sit with uncertainty for a very long time without being undone by it, someone who understood the blank space on a page was not a failure, but an invitation, patient waiting for the information that would, eventually, arrive. The tradition of European cartography as we understand it, the careful, methodical ink on vellum tradition that produced the great atlases of the 16th and 17th centuries, grew out of a confluence of older practices. The ancient geographers of the Greek and Roman world had understood, in a theoretical sense, that the Earth was a sphere, and they had developed systems of coordinates and projection that would not be significantly improved upon for more than 1,000 years. Ptolemy of Alexandria, working in the 2nd century after Christ, produced a guide to map making so comprehensive and so carefully reasoned that cartographers were still consulting it and still arguing about it 14 centuries after his death. His work described not just how to draw coastlines and place cities, but how to think about the relationship between a curved surface and a flat page, a problem that, as any cartographer will tell you, has no perfect solution, only a series of compromises, each of which preserves some things accurately at the cost of distorting others. Through the long medieval centuries, the practice of making maps did not disappear, but it changed in character. The great Mapae Mundi of the medieval period, those extraordinary circular documents that placed Jerusalem at the center of the world and filled the margins with sea monsters and fantastical peoples, were not intended as practical navigation tools. They were cosmological statements, expressions of a worldview in which geography and theology were deeply intertwined, in which the shape of the earth was also the shape of sacred history. They are remarkable objects, these medieval maps, and they reward patient study. But they belong to a different tradition than the one we are concerned with tonight. The, the tradition of practical, measured, correctable cartography that emerged slowly during the 14th and 15th centuries and reached its first flowering in the Portolan charts of the Mediterranean sailors. The Portolan charts were something new. They were made by sailors, for sailors, based on the accumulated experience of generations of mariners who had crossed and recrossed the same stretches of sea and had learned through repetition and careful attention the precise shape of every harbor and headland. These charts were drawn on single sheets of vellum, often the skin of a single large animal, and they were oriented not north, but toward whatever direction was most useful for the intended voyage. They were covered in a web of rum lines radiating from compass roses, and their coastlines, particularly those of the Mediterranean, were rendered with a precision that would not be significantly improved upon until the age of modern surveying. They were working tools, held and folded and annotated and corrected over years of use, and most of them have not survived. But the ones that have survived are breathtaking in their accuracy, breathtaking in the evidence they carry of careful, repeated, loving observation. By the 15th century, the two traditions, the theoretical, mathematical cartography, descended from Ptolemy. What? And the practical empirical cartography of the Portolan makers had begun to merge. The great rediscovery of Ptolemy's geography in Western Europe, translated into Latin in the early 1400s, gave scholars and mapmakers a new theoretical framework within which to organize the observations pouring in from explorers and merchants and pilgrims. And the observations themselves were arriving with increasing speed and in increasing volume as European sailors pushed further along the African coast and eventually across the Atlantic and around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, returning with accounts of coastlines and peoples and distances that no previous map had ever attempted to represent. It was in this context, this period of extraordinary expansion and revision and excited, restless accumulation of new geographic knowledge, that the workshops of the great cartographic families established themselves in the cities of northern Europe. In Antwerp, in Amsterdam, in Venice, in Lisbon, workshops that combined the functions of a scholarly library, a printing house, and an artist's studio produced the great atlases that would define European geographical knowledge for the next 2 centuries. These were not small operations. They employed engravers and colorists and binders and salesmen, as well as the scholars and surveyors who produced the geographic content itself. The making of a major atlas was a commercial enterprise as much as a scholarly one, and the great cartographic families, the Mercators, the Hondiani, the Blaius of Amsterdam, competed fiercely for patron, and for access to the latest surveys and travel accounts. But alongside these large commercial operations, there existed a quieter tradition of individual cartographic work, single scholars or small workshops, producing maps not for the great atlas market, but for specific patrons, specific purposes, specific places that the commercial publishers found too obscure or too politically sensitive to include in their general offerings. It was in this quieter tradition that our story finds its home, not in the grand workshops of Amsterdam or Venice, but in a smaller city, in a smaller room where a single candle burned late into the evening and a single pair of hands moved with great deliberations across a sheet of vellum, tracing the contours of a land that the great publishers had never thought worth the cost of an engraving. And if your thoughts are beginning to soften at the edges now, if The details of centuries and workshops and vellum sheets are beginning to blur gently together into a general impression of how quiet rooms and careful work and the smell of ink drying in the evening air. That is precisely the right way to receive this story. Let it settle around you like the warmth of a room that has held a fire all day, even after the fire itself has burned down to embers. There are places in the world that exist most fully in the hours before dawn, when the light has not yet committed itself to any particular color, and the landscape holds its shapes in a kind of provisional quiet, as if waiting for permission to become fully itself again. The land at the center of our story was, by many accounts of those who traveled through it in the 18th and early 19th centuries, precisely such a place. Travelers who passed through it in the cooler months describe mornings of extraordinary stillness, a mist that settled in the valleys and did not lift until well past midday, a quality of light on the hillsides that seemed to belong to no particular hour, a silence broken only by the sound of water moving somewhere below the road, unseen but constant, the way a thought moves just beneath the surface of a drowsy mind. The territory in question was situated in that broad, complicated region of Central Europe where the great river systems divide and the mountain ranges send their various arms in directions that have always made the drawing of clean political borders an exercise in optimism. It was a land of moderate hills and wide river valleys, of dense oak forests interspersed with stretches of cultivated plain where wheat and rye grew in long wind-stirred fields that travelers compared again and again in their journals to the surface of a slow sea. Its towns were modest in size, but old in character, built along the lines of roads that had been walked for centuries before anyone thought to give them names, and marked at their centers by stone churches and market squares where merchants from several different linguistic traditions met each week to conduct the ordinary business of exchange in a mixture of languages that longtime residents navigated with the ease of long habit. The people who lived there were themselves a mixture of languages, of customs, of the various religious and administrative traditions that had washed over the region in successive waves across the preceding centuries. There were communities that had been settled there for so long that they no longer retained any memory of having arrived from elsewhere, and there were others that had come more recently, within the last 2 or 3 generations, drawn by the particular economic conditions of a border region where the rules shifted depending on which side of a certain river you happened to be standing on. They lived, for the most part, in something approaching ordinary equanimity, the ordinary equanimity of people who have learned, across many generations, that the name of the authority above them is likely to change within their lifetime, and that the wisest response to this knowledge is to tend one's fields and maintain one's relations with one's neighbors with as much consistency and goodwill as the seasons allow. The region had been, at various points in its history, a province of a larger kingdom, then a semi-autonomous duchy, then a contested territory claimed by two competing powers who had agreed in a series of treaties negotiated in cities far from the territory itself to a border arrangement that satisfied neither of them and confused nearly everyone who lived near it. By the middle of the 18th century, the period in which our story begins to take shape, the territory occupied a position of particular administrative ambiguity recognized in practice by the surrounding sign powers, but belonging, on paper, to a political arrangement that was already under considerable pressure from the larger reorganizations then transforming the map of the continent. The people who lived there understood this in the way that people who live close to the land understand weather, not as an abstract political analysis, but as a felt condition, a slight instability in the quality of the ordinary, a sense that the familiar arrangements of the world were held in place by forces whose continued cooperation could not be entirely assumed. The landscape itself seemed, to those who paid attention to such things, to carry the weight of this history quietly and without complaint. The old roads, Roman in some stretches, medieval in others, widened and resurfaced at various points across the centuries by various authorities who had claimed temporary jurisdiction over the territory, ran through the countryside with the particular directness of paths that have been used for so long that they have become, in a sense, part of the landscape rather than an imposition upon it. The rivers bore names in several languages simultaneously, each community along their banks using whichever version had been in use in their grandparents' time, so that the same river might be called by three different names within the space of a single morning's journey. The forests that covered the higher ground were full of the remains of older settlements, foundations visible beneath the undergrowth, the occasional remnant of a wall or a mill structure that no one living could entirely account for, belonging to periods before the current memory of the place had begun. In the spring, the valley floors flooded gently, and the farmers moved their animals to the higher ground and waited with the particular patience of people who have done this every year of their lives and every year of their parents' lives before them. In the summer, the wheat fields turned the color of old honey, and the roads became pale with dust, and merchants moved along them in both directions. Their carts, loaded with goods whose origins were distributed across several different economic and political systems that had not, as yet, resolved their boundaries into anything permanent. In the autumn, the oak forests turned slowly through amber and rust, and the mist that would define the winter months began to gather in the lower valleys. In the evenings, retreating each morning, but leaving behind a general softening of the light that lasted through the short days and gave the landscape, even at midday, the quality of something seen through gauze. And if your own breath is slowing now, if the fields and the rivers and the autumn are settling gently over your thoughts, the way the real mist settled over those real valleys, then you are moving, without any effort at all, in exactly the right direction. The land is quiet, the season is turning, and somewhere, in a room, in a town whose name appears on only a handful of surviving documents, a cartographer is setting out his instruments and beginning, very slowly, to draw. There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to rooms full of old paper. It is not the silence of emptiness, nor the silence of abandonment. It is something closer to the quiet of a library. At closing time, when the last reader has gone and the books are left to breathe on their own, settling gently into their shelves, releasing the faint, warm smell of vellum and dust, and ink that has long since dried to the color of amber. It is the kind of quiet that asks nothing of you. It simply surrounds you the way water surrounds a stone at the bottom of a slow river, and holds you there very gently in the dark. Tonight we begin in such a room. It is a small room somewhere in a city whose name has changed at least twice in the last 300 years, in a building that was once a private residence, then a minor government office, then a storage house for documents that no one quite knew how to discard. The ceiling is low, and the beams are dark with age. A single window looks out onto a courtyard where, if it were daylight and you were inclined to look, you might see a stone fountain that no longer runs, and a fig tree growing quietly through the cracks of the paving. But it is not daylight now. It is evening, or perhaps later than evening. The courtyard is invisible, and the only light in the room comes from a cone set on the edge of a wide wooden table, burning low and steady, casting a circle of amber warmth that does not quite reach the corners. On the table, beneath that candle, there is a map. It is large, larger than you might expect, rolled out across the full width of the table and weighted at its corners with smooth river stones that someone placed there long ago and never thought to remove. The vellum is old and has taken on the particular cream and shadow quality that only comes with centuries of careful storage. Along its edges, the ink has faded in places to the palest brown, like the color of tea left too long in the cup. But at its center, the lines are still crisp, still deliberate, still carrying the intention of the hand that drew them with extraordinary patience and care. Mountains rise in careful hatching. Rivers move in long, unhurried curves toward coasts that are rendered with such precision that you can almost feel the cold of the water. Roads connect towns whose names are written in a script so small and neat that you would need to lean very close, with the candle held just so, to read them. And then, at a certain point, the lines simply stop, not abruptly. There is no sense of urgency in the ending, no suggestion that the hand which drew them was interrupted or alarmed. The lines simply grow fewer, and then sparse, and then the vellum opens into a wide, unmarked emptiness that extends across what would have been, had it been completed, the southeastern quarter of the country. A country that, by the time this map was abandoned, had already ceased to exist in the way its maker had known it. The borders it traces belong to a political reality that dissolved slowly over the course of several decades, absorbed into larger territories, renamed, renegotiated, and eventually filed away in the archives of empires that themselves no longer stand. His name was Heinrich Brauer, and he was, by the time our story finds him, a man in his middle 60s who had spent the better part of 4 decades in the same set of rooms on the upper floor of a narrow building on a quiet street in a provincial city whose importance had once been greater than it was now. He was not a famous man, not in the way that the great cartographers of Amsterdam and Vienna were famous. His name did not appear in the major atlases. His work was not collected by the courts of Europe, and no portrait of him survives, if one was ever made. What survives is his work, a series of regional maps of remarkable precision and care, produced over the course of a long, quiet career for patrons who valued accuracy over elegance, and a correspondence with several other scholars of geography that reveals, in its careful and unhurried prose, a mind of considerable depth and a temperament of unusual steadiness. He rose by habit before the light. This was not the romantic habit of the artistic temperament, seeking inspiration in the pre-dawn quiet, but the practical habit of a working man who had learned early in his career that the best hours for detailed drawing were the hours before the city outside his window had accumulated the small daily noises, the carts on the cobblestones, the voices in the street below, the bells of the church 2 corners away that marked the canonical hours with a regularity he had long since ceased to notice consciously, but which still, on some level, organized his sense of the day's progress. He would rise, dress in the same unhurried sequence he had followed for years, and make his way to the studio where the previous evening's work would be waiting for him. On the table, the lines settled into the vellum with permanence. The, that only comes after the, the night has passed over them. The studio itself was a room of moderate size, its walls lined on two sides with shelves that held rolled maps and folded documents, and the various reference materials, gazetteers, travel accounts, administrative records obtained through correspondence with officials in various cities that formed the working library of an active cartographer. The instruments were kept on a separate, smaller table near the window. The dividers and compasses in their fitted wooden case, the straight edges of varying lengths, the set of fine brushes used for applying color washes to finished maps, the small horn of powdered pumice used for correcting errors in the vellum before the ink had fully set. Everything had its place, and everything was returned to its place at the end of each working day with a consistency that was less obsessive than simply practical. A man who works alone with small, precise instruments cannot afford the inefficiency of searching for things. Breakfast was bread and a soft cheese that he purchased each week from a market stall run by a family he had been buying from for so long that the transaction required no words, only the exchange of coin and a nod of mutual recognition. He ate at the corner of the drawing table, standing, looking at whatever portion of the current project was laid out before him. Not working, exactly, but allowing his eyes to move across the surface of the map in a general, unfocused way that he had found, over the years, was often when the solutions to problems presented themselves. A coastline that had resisted resolution the previous evening would sometimes clarify itself in these morning minutes, not through any active effort of analysis, but through the simple benefit of rest and the particular quality of early light falling across the vellum at an angle that revealed things the lamp had hidden. His students, and there had been several over the years, young men from the city, and occasionally from further afield whose families had arranged for them to spend a period learning the craft, remembered him, in the accounts that survive, as a teacher of great patience and very few words. He did not explain the principles of cartographic projection with lectures or diagrams. He demonstrated them working alongside his apprentices at the table, letting the practice precede the theory in the conviction that a hand which had learned to do something correct would understand this explanation of why it was correct far more readily than a mind that had only encountered the explanation in the abstract. He corrected errors without expression, redrawing the incorrect line beside the apprentice's attempt, so that the comparison was visible, the difference between the two lines constituting a lesson more eloquent than anything he might have said. In the evenings after the apprentice had gone home, and the city outside had settled into its nighttime rhythms, Brauer would return to the large project that had occupied his private hours for the better part of a decade. The great map of the border territory, the ambitious, patient, slowly accumulating record of a land he had first traveled through as a young man of 23, and to which he had returned, in memory and in correspondence, and in the careful analysis of every survey and travel account he could obtain ever since. He worked on it differently than he worked on his commissioned maps, more slowly, more contemplatively, sometimes spending an entire evening simply reading accounts of a particular valley or river crossing, rather than drawing anything at all, building in his mind a picture of sufficient richness and accuracy that when he did finally set pen to vellum, the line emerged not as a approximation, but as something closer to a recognition. The candle would burn low beside him. The city would grow quiet, and Brower would sit at his table in the amber light, moving with great deliberation across the surface of a country that was, even as he drew it, already beginning. In the world outside his window, its long, slow process of becoming something else. She arrived on a Tuesday in early October, when the leaves on the lime trees lining the street outside Brower's building had turned to the color of pale straw, and were beginning, in the mild, unhurried way of that particular autumn, to release themselves one by one and drift down onto the cobblestones below. Her name was Anna Voss, and she was 17 years old, the daughter of a surveyor from a town 2 days' journey to the east, whose professional acquaintance with Brower had been maintained through correspondence for the better part of a decade. The arrangement had been proposed by her father in a letter written the previous spring, offered not with any particular urgency, but with the quiet confidence of a man who understood the value of what he was asking for and trusted that the person he was asking would understand it too. Brower had agreed, after a pause of several weeks that was itself a form of consideration rather than hesitation, in a reply of characteristic brevity that confirmed the terms and suggested October as a suitable time to begin. She carried with her a leather satchel containing 2 changes of clothing, a small collection of her father's surveying notes that she had been permitted to bring as reference material, and a set of drawing instruments, compass, dividers, a small straight edge that had been her father's before they were hers, and that bore, on the inside of the fitted case, an engraved inscription in a hand she did not recognize, belonging to some earlier owner whose name had been partially worn away by years of handling. She had been drawing since she was old enough to hold a pen with any steadiness, first copying the maps her father kept in his office at home, and then, as her skill developed, assisting him with the fair copies of his survey work. The clean final versions, drafted on good paper, that he submitted to the various municipal and its ministry bodies, what that commissioned his measurements. She understood already, when she arrived at Brower's door, a considerable amount about the practical mechanics of the craft. What she did not yet understand, and what she had come to learn, was how to think like a cartographer, how to hold an entire landscape in the mind simultaneously and render it, in the compression that a flat surface demands, without losing the essential truth of its relationships. Brower opened the door himself, which she had not expected. She had imagined a household with at least some minimal domestic staff, and regarded her for a moment with the same quiet, assessing attention he brought to no new document, taking in what was there without immediately forming a conclusion about it. He showed her the studio, the shelves, the instruments, the current state of the commissioned work on the table, explaining each in a few careful sentences that were informative without being elaborate. He showed her the small room on the floor above, that would be hers for the duration of the arrangement, furnished simply with a bed, a washstand, a table with a lamp, and a single shelf that was empty and waiting. He told her the hours of work, the expectations regarding the care of the instruments, and the procedure for obtaining additional materials. when the supply of a particular ink or a particular weight of paper ran low. And then he returned to the studio, sat down at the table, and resumed the work he had apparently been in the middle of when she knocked. And she understood, with a clarity that required no further elaboration, that she was expected to do the same. The first weeks were occupied with the fundamentals, not because Brauer doubted her existing skills, but because he believed, as a matter of considered principle, that even a capable student benefited from returning to the beginning of a craft and performing its most basic operations with a fresh attention. She ground pigments, the various earth colors, and the more expensive mineral blues and greens that were mixed with gum arabic to produce the washes applied to finished maps. She stretched vellum on frames, learning to feel for the evenness of the tension across the surface in the way that a musician learns to feel for the tuning of a string, not through measurement, but through a developed sensitivity in the fingertips. She copied coastlines from the reference maps on the shelves, not the interesting or complex ones, but the simplest and most regular, practicing the control of pressure and speed that produces a line of consistent weight from beginning to end, a line that does not betray in its variation the hesitations and adjustments of the hand that drew it. Brower watched her work with the same peripheral attention with which he watched everything, present and observant without being intrusive, noting what he needed to note without converting his observations into commentary, unless commentary was genuinely necessary. He corrected, when correction was needed, with the quiet economy of gesture she would come to recognize as his characteristic mode. A brief demonstration, a comparison placed beside the original, a silence that invited the student to find the difference for herself rather than having it named. He did not praise extravagantly, but neither did he withhold acknowledgement when work merited it. A nod, occasionally a single word, that carried, in its restraint, a weight of genuine approbation that she came to value more than any more expansive expression of approval might have carried. In the evenings, when the formal work of the day was complete, she would sometimes remain in the studio, after Brower had retired to his private project, working by lamplight on exercises of her own choosing, copying the more complex maps from the shelves, attempting small original sketches of the view from the studio window, the roof lines, and the lime trees, and the cobblestones below, rendered in the conventions of cartographic representation, as if the street outside were a territory worth mapping. She was, in these quiet hours, happy in a way that was difficult to articulate, but unmistakable in its quality. The particular happiness of someone doing the thing they are suited to, in a place that asks of them exactly the right amount and no more. The candle low and steady, the room quiet and still. And outside, the last of the lime tree leaves releasing themselves into the October dark, drifting down toward the cobblestones in no particular hurry, as if the ground could wait. Anna had been working in the studio for nearly 3 months before she fully understood what the large unrolled document at the back of the lower shelf actually was. She had noticed it from her first days there. It was impossible not to notice, being considerably larger than the other stored maps, wrapped in a piece of undyed linen that had been tied with particular care in a bow rather than a knot, as if whoever had wrapped it intended to open it again soon and wished to preserve that possibility with a minimum of inconvenience. But it was not among the documents Brauer had shown her during her initial orientation, and she had understood, without needing to be told explicitly, that the things he had not shown her were not yet hers to ask about. She had learned in those first months to read the room's silences as carefully as she read its contents. It was on a Wednesday evening in January, when the cold outside had closed the studio down to the dimensions of the lamplight, and the streets below had been quiet for hours, that Brower first unrolled the map in her presence. He did it without preamble, moving to the lower shelf, the lower shelf with deliberate unhaste of a man performing a familiar ritual, lifting the linen-wrapped roll and carrying it to the main table with both hands, setting it down with a care that was itself a form of communication. He untied the bow and let the linen fall away, and then, using the same smooth river stones from the corners of the table, weighted the vellum open and stepped back slightly, as if to give it room to be itself before anyone tried to read it. Anna set down her pen and looked at what lay before her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The map was remarkable, even in its unfinished state, perhaps especially in its unfinished state. It had a quality that the commissioned work on the table beside it, precise and competent as that work was, did not possess. The finished portions were drawn with a density of information that she had not seen in any of the reference maps on the shelves. Not just the major features of the landscape, but the minor ones, the ones that only someone who had walked the land or spoken at great length with people who had would think to include. Footpaths that connected villages too small to appear on administrative maps, the locations of seasonal bridges, structures erected each autumn over the shallower river crossings, and removed each spring before the floodwaters rose. The sites of markets that met not weekly but monthly, at intervals corresponding to the cycles of the agricultural year rather than the cycles of the administrative calendar. The particular bends in roads where travelers for generations had stopped to rest, because the view opened suddenly westward, and the hills in the distance turned at certain hours of the afternoon, a color that was worth a moment's pause to observe. Brower told her, in his measured way, what the map was and where it depicted. He told her something of the territory's political history, the successive arrangements, the contested borders, the treaties negotiated in distant cities, in the same calm, unhurried tone in which he told her everything, as if the complexity of the situation were simply another set of contour lines to be accurately rendered rather than a cause for to any particular feeling. He told her that he had begun the map more than 12 years before, initially as a private project with no specific patron or purpose beyond the desire to produce a complete and accurate record of a territory that he believed was underserved by the existing cartographic literature. He told her that he had, over those 12 years, made two extended journeys to the region to take measurements and make observations, and had supplemented his own fieldwork with extensive correspondence with local administrators, clergy, and scholars who could provide information about areas he had not personally visited. And he told her, with the same equanimity with which he told her everything else, that the territory depicted on the map had, in the time since he began it, undergone significant political change, that the administrative arrangements under which it had existed when he first traveled, there were now largely dissolved, and that the land itself, while physically unchanged, existed within a different set of governing realities than those he had originally intended to document. Anna looked at the empty southeastern quarter, the wide, unmarked expanse of vellum that waited at the map's lower right, and asked him, carefully, because she had learned to be careful with her questions in this room, whether he intended to complete it. Brauer was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not an absence of response, but a consideration of how to give one honestly. He said that he had gathered, over the years, sufficient the information to complete at least the major features of the missing quarter, and that the detailed notes for that portion of the map existed in a series of folios on the upper shelf, compiled from correspondence and from the accounts of travelers who had passed through the region in the preceding decades. He said that he had not yet drawn those features onto the vellum, not because the information was insufficient, but because the act of completing the map felt to him like something that needed to be approached with a particular quality of attention that he had not yet managed to bring fully to bear. He said this without embarrassment or apology, simply as a description of a condition he found himself in, as one might describe the weather. She understood, or thought she understood, something of what he meant. There are projects that resist completion, not because they are too difficult, but because they are too important. Because the finishedness of a thing represents a kind of closing that the maker is not entirely ready to perform. The map was, in some sense, as long as it remained unfinished, still in conversation with the territory it depicted, still open to revision and addition, and the incorporation of new information. To complete it would be to make a claim, a definitive claim about the shape and character of a place that was itself, in the world outside the studio, no longer entirely stable in its identity. And perhaps that was the true difficulty, not the missing lines themselves, but the question of whether drawing them would constitute an act of preservation or an act of mourning. The candle beside the map burned low and steady. The linen wrapping lay beside it on the table, still holding the shape of what it had contained, and outside, the January cold pressed quietly against the glass of the studio window, patient as everything else in this room, willing to wait. One note beside the symbol for a small monastery situated on a hillside above the second largest river read simply, "The brothers here keep a garden of medicinal plants, whose cultivation predates the current foundation by at least 2 centuries, according to their own account, and the garden wall on the eastern side incorporates stonework of a markedly earlier period than the rest of the structure." Another, alongside a road in the central section, noted that the road curved noticeably west of the most direct line between two towns, because the direct line would have passed through a low-lying area that remained waterlogged for much of the year, a condition local farmers attributed to an underground spring, whose exact location no one had been able to determine. These notes were not necessary to the map's function as a geographic document. They were something additional, a record of the texture of the place, the small particular truths that a traveler, with good eyes and sufficient patience, and the willingness to ask questions and listen carefully to the answers, would accumulate over years of attentive presence. It was in the late afternoon of the second day of reading that she turned her attention fully to the empty southeastern quarter, and brought out, for the first time, the folios from the upper shelf that Brauer's note had mentioned. There were 4 of them, each containing a different category of material. surveying notes from his own field work in that region during his second journey, conducted nearly 15 years before his death, transcribed passages from the travel accounts and administrative records he had consulted, correspondence with two local scholars whose knowledge of the southeastern territory was evidently considerable, and a set of rough preliminary sketches done in pencil on ordinary paper showing the major features of the missing quarter as he had understood them at various stages of his research. The sketches were not polished. They were working documents, full of corrections and alternative versions and small written questions to himself about details he had not yet resolved, but they were legible and taken together with the other materials. In the folios, they constituted something very close to a complete picture of what the buff- finished southeastern quarter should contain. And if your own eyes are moving more slowly now, if the lamp and the vellum and the folios are beginning to blur at their edges into the general warmth of a quiet room at the end of a long day of careful reading, then you are resting in exactly the right place, and the map, patient as it has always been, will be there when you return to it. The evenings were long, and the lamp burned low as she worked. The city outside grew quiet, and the studio was filled with the same quiet that had filled it during Brauer's lifetime, the quiet of paper and ink, and the careful work of hands that had learned, over years, to do what they were doing with a steady attention that did not falter. She worked without hurry, and she worked without forcing the completion. Some days, she drew only a small portion of the map, a single river or a single road, and on other days, she drew more. But she never rushed, never pushed the work beyond the pace that felt right. Never sacrificed the quality of the line for the sake of finishing sooner. She understood now, with a clarity that was not intellectual, but was more like a kind of embodied knowledge, why Brauer had hesitated. The completion of the map was not a matter of filling in the blanks. It was a matter of bringing to the work the same quality of attention that had been brought to it over the years, the same quality of attention that the place itself deserved. The final line she drew was not the last river or the last road. It was the name of a small village in the far southeastern corner of the territory, a village that appeared on no official map and that Brower had mentioned only in passing in one of his letters to a local scholar. On her journey, she had found it on her journey, stopped there for an hour at the inn near the church, asked the innkeeper about the village and its history, written the name in her notebook with the note that the village had been there for as long as anyone could remember, and that the people who lived there used the old name, even though the official documents used a different one. And now she wrote that name on the map, in the same careful script as all the others, placing it beside the symbol for the village, with the same deliberation she had given to the largest city in the territory. She set down the pen. She sat back in the chair. She looked at the map, at the completed southeastern quarter, at the lines and the names and the marginal notes that filled the space that had been empty for so long. The lamp beside the map burned low and steady. The room was quiet and still. And the map that had waited through the years of Brower's life, and the months of her journey, and the weeks of her work, was finally complete. Not because every blank had been filled, but because the attention had been brought to it. The attention that Brower had understood was necessary. The attention that the place deserved. The attention that said this mattered. This was worth remembering. This was worth preservation, even if the political reality above it had changed beyond recognition. The candle was low, the room was quiet, and the long, slow, careful work, was done. The studio was as the landlady had described it, and as she had always known it: quiet, orderly, smelling of ink and vellum, and the faint residue of the extinguished lamp. The morning light came through the window at its March angle, lying in a long, pale rectangle across the main table, and illuminating a portion of the commissioned map that Brauer had been working on the previous week. Its coast, ins river systems rendered in his characteristic Edan, steady and precise and entirely without flourish. She stood at the table for a while, looking at the work with the attention he had taught her to bring to it. Then she turned to the lower shelf, and she saw, propped against the front of the linen-wrapped roll, a folded piece of paper with her name written on it, in Brower's small, neat hand. The note was brief. She would not have expected otherwise. It said that the map was hers, along with the folios on the upper shelf that contained the research materials for the unfinished southeastern quarter. It said that he did not require her to complete it, that he understood the difficulty of completing another person's work, and did not wish to impose that difficulty upon her as an obligation. But it said also that the materials were sufficient, that the information was there, and that, if she felt at some point that she was able to bring to the task the quality of attention it required, then the map would be waiting. It was signed with his initials, in the same hand as the address on the envelope. Unhurried, regular. The hand of a man who had written carefully all his life and saw no reason to change in the final note he would ever set down. Anna folded the paper and placed it in the pocket of her coat. She stood for a long moment in the quiet of the studio, with the morning light on the table and the smell of old paper around her. And then she reached down and lifted the linen-wrapped roll from the shelf and held it with both hands, the way Brower had always carried it, as if it were something that deserved to be held carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it was important. And those two things she had learned in this room were not always the same. In the market town, which she reached on a Friday that happened to be the third Friday of the month, the market was in full swing. The square was filled with stalls and carts and people, and the air was full of the sounds of commerce and conversation in the mixed languages that characterized the region. Anna walked through the market slowly, observing the arrangement of the stalls, the goods that were being sold, the particular patterns of movement and interaction that characterized this gathering. She spoke with a woman who had been coming to the market for 40 years, who told her that the market had been held on the third Friday since before she was born, and probably before her mother was born, and that the day had changed only once in her memory, when a political dispute had forced a temporary relocation to a different day, but that everyone had returned to the third Friday as soon as this dispute was resolved, because it was the right day. The one that had always been right, the one that fit into the rhythm of the agricultural year and the weather and the cycles of planting and harvesting, in a way that other days did not. She spent the night in the market town, and in the morning she continued on through the territory, moving from one village and one roadside inn to the next, asking questions and listening to answers, making her sketches and her notes, and accumulating, slowly and without forcing it, the kind of understanding that comes from presence rather than from analysis alone. She met people who used the old names for places that had been officially renamed, who spoke of the old borders as if they were still the ones that mattered, who carried in their daily speech and practiced the memory of a political reality that no longer existed on paper, but still existed in the way they moved through the world and understood their relationship to the land and to each other. And if your own thoughts are beginning to move more slowly now, if the villages and the market towns and the people who remember are becoming part of a general impression of quiet places and steady voices and the long continuity of ordinary life, then you are resting in exactly the right place. And the journey, like all the best journeys, is taking you exactly where you need to go. The road ahead is clear, the evening is soft, and the next village, with its church and its inn and its people who have lived in the same place for generations, is waiting. Anna decided in the week after she had finished reading the folios to go to the southeastern territory herself. She did not make this decision with any sense of urgency or drama, but with the same quiet deliberation she brought to everything in that room. The materials Brower had left were sufficient, as his note had said, but they were 20 years old at their most recent, and the territory they described had been, in those 20 years, passing through the slow reorganizations and administrative changes that had been forming the landscape of Central Europe for decades. The roads might have been widened or rerouted. The bridges might have been rebuilt or removed. The seasonal markets might have been moved to different days or discontinued entirely. Uh, the information was there, but it was information that had been filtered through memory and correspondence and the indirect accounts of other people. She wanted to see it herself, to walk the ground and feel, in her own body, the quality of the light on those hills and the angle at which the river approached the old crossing and the way the road curved because of the underground spring that no one had ever pinpointed. She prepared for the journey with the same care she had brought to her work in the studio. She packed a small leather satchel with the folios, with a notebook for her own observations, with ink and paper, and a few essential drawing instruments. She took with her the map itself, rolled and wrapped in its linen, carrying it in a long cylindrical case that she had commissioned from a local leather worker who had made it to her exact specifications, with a shoulder strap and a clasp that would not accidentally open. She planned to travel by the ordinary routes, the passenger coach to the nearest major town, then by foot and by local carrier wagon along the smaller roads that led into the countryside. She had spent enough time in Brauer's correspondence to understand the geography of the region and the locations of the towns and villages that appeared in his notes. She was not going with a specific agenda or a deadline, but with the general intention of moving through the southeastern quarter of the territory the way a cartographer moves through unfamiliar land. Slowly, attentively, with the willingness to pause whenever something warranted a closer look. The first days of the journey followed the familiar rhythm of travel. The coach jolted along the main road, the wheels on the cobblestones, giving way to the softer vibration of packed earth as the road moved into the countryside. She looked out the window at the passing landscape, the fields, the occasional isolated farmhouse, the small villages clustered around their churches and market squares. She noted in the way she had learned to note things. The way the road changed as it moved from one administrative territory to another, the way the character of the buildings shifted gradually as the available building materials and the local architectural traditions changed. She was not thinking about the map continuously, But the map was there in the case beside her, and the territory she was passing through was related to it in a way that she could feel even when she was not actively examining their relationship. When she reached the town where the main road diverged from the route into the southeastern territory, she left the coach and began walking. The road was narrower here, less traveled, and the settlements along it were smaller and more widely spaced. She walked through the afternoon, the cylindrical case was on her shoulder, the sun at her back, moving steadily in the direction of the border that Brauer had marked on the map, uh, with a line that grew fainter as it moved into the southeastern quarter, as if he himself had been uncertain about the precision of that boundary. She crossed the river at a stone bridge that Brauer had described in one of his notes, and she stopped there for a while, looking at the water and the way the current moved around the piers, noting the quality of the light on the stone and the way the moss grew on the upstream side of the bridge in a pattern that suggested the prevailing direction of the water during the flood seasons. She made a small sketch in her notebook, not for the map itself, but for her own understanding, and then she continued on. The note he had left her, the brief note that said the map was hers and that he did not require her to complete it, but that the materials were sufficient, had not been a release from obligation. It had been a gift. It had been an invitation to bring her own understanding to the task, to make the selections and judgments that Brower had not been able to complete, to decide for herself what mattered and what deserved to be preserved. He had understood that the map was not finished, not because it was incomplete, but because it was still open to the quality of attention that the person who completed it would bring to it. The act of completion was not a mechanical transfer of information from the folios to the vellum. It was an act of interpretation, of judgment, of the same kind of attention that Brower had brought to the work over the years of his life. She looked at the empty southeastern quarter, and she looked at the notes and the sketches from her journey, and she began to understand what she needed to do. She would complete the map, but she would complete it not as a mechanical exercise, but as an act of the same quality of attention that Brower had brought to it. She would draw the rivers, and the roads, and the settlements with the precision that the cartographic tradition demanded. But she would also include the marginal notes, the descriptions of things that could not be fully expressed in the map's symbolic vocabulary. She would include the monastery on the hillside with the ancient garden, the road that curved because of the underground spring, the market town that met on the third Friday of the month. She would include the old names that people still used in their everyday speech. She would include the understanding that the borders were not lines but transitions, that the place was not a political entity but a continuity of practices and memories and relationships that had been tested by time and found to be useful. And she would do all of this not as a departure from the cartographic tradition, but as its fullest expression, the kind of work that Brower himself had moving toward in the years before his death. The lamp beside the map burned low and steady. The room was quiet and still, and the empty southeastern quarter, the wide unmarked expanse of vellum that had waited for so long, was beginning slowly and without any hurry, Tully, to fill itself with the understanding that had come to her in the quiet hours of the evening and the early morning, without any effort at all, the way the best understandings come. She rolled the map carefully, using the same smooth river stones that Brauer had used to weight the corners, the same linen that had been tied with the bow he had tied with particular care. She tied the ribbon around the cartographer, not too tight and not too loose, the way she had seen Brauer tie it, the way that preserved the shape without constraining the vellum. She placed the cylindrical case on the table beside her and sat for a while in the quiet of the studio, the lamp low and steady, the room quiet and still. The work was done. The map was complete. And now, inevitably, it was time to let it go, to release it from the table and the lamp and the careful attention that had sustained it for so long, to place it somewhere it could rest, somewhere it could be preserved for whoever might come after and might need to see it, might need to understand what Brower had understood, and what she had come to understand and on her journey through the territory. The archive where she placed it was not a grand institution, not the great library of a capital city or the collection of a royal court. It was a modest archive in a provincial city, one of the many regional archives that had been established over the centuries to preserve the documents that did not belong to the great central collections, but that were still worth keeping, still worth remembering. The archivist, a woman whose face showed the particular quality of someone who had spent many years among old paper and ink and the careful work of preservation, received the map with a quiet appreciation that was not effusive, but was genuine. She took the cylindrical case with both hands, set it on the table, and unrolled it with the same care that Anna had used to roll it. She looked at the map for a long time, moving her eyes across the completed portions, the rivers and roads and settlements, the marginal notes that filled the borders with the quiet testimony of attention. She asked Anna questions about the map, about Brower, about the journey that had been necessary to complete it. Anna answered in the same unhurried way that Brower had answered her questions, in the same quiet way that the prior had answered her questions at the monastery, in the same way that good questions were answered in the studio. She told the story of the map, of Brower's 12 years of work, of the note he had left her, of her journey through the southeastern territory, of the understanding that had come to her in the quiet hours of the evenings and the early mornings. The archivist listened with the same attention that Anna had learned to bring to everything in the studio, and when Anna had finished, the archivist said that the map belonged here. I, in this archive, among the other documents that had been preserved through the centuries, the other maps that represented places that no longer existed in the way they had been depicted, the other records of attention and care, and the long, slow work of understanding. The map was placed on a shelf among thousands of other documents, rolled and tied with ribbon, set in a position where it could be retrieved when needed and returned when the work was done. The archive was quiet, and it smelled of old paper and ink, and the faint residue of beeswax from the candles that had been used for centuries before the electric lights were installed. The shelves stretched into the distance, and on each shelf there were rolls and folders and boxes, each containing something that someone had decided was worth preserving, worth remembering, worth keeping for whoever might come after. The map was one among many, but it was not lost among them. It had its place, and it would remain in that place, patient as the stones in the garden wall, patient as the road that curved because of the underground spring, patient as the market town that met on the third Friday of the month. This was not a failure, she thought. It was simply the of the thing. A map was always a compression, always a simplification, always a selection of what was considered important from among the infinite details that made up the actual place. The art of cartographies was the art of making those selections wisely, of choosing what to include and what to leave out, of rendering the essential relationships without being overwhelmed by the extraordinary richness of the actual territory. Brower had understood this, and that was why he had written the marginal notes, why he had included the descriptions of things that could not be fully expressed in the map's symbolic vocabulary. He had understood that the map alone was not enough, that it needed to be accompanied by the words, by the prose descriptions that carried what the symbols could not convey. And that was why he had hesitated, why he had not completed the map, because he had understood that the act of completing it was not simply a matter of drawing the remaining lines. It was a matter of deciding what to include and what to leave out, of making the final selections that would define the map's understanding of the place. She looked at the empty southeastern quarter, the wide unmarked expanse of vellum that waited at the map's lower right. And she thought about what she had learned on her journey. She thought about the monastery on the hillside and the garden that had remained through centuries of change. She thought about the road that curved because of the underground spring. She thought about the market town that met on the third Friday of the month and the people who used the old names for places that had been officially renamed. She thought about the prior's words about the stones in the garden wall, and she thought about the way the actual boundaries of the territory were not lines, but transitions, not declarations, but understandings. And she began, slowly and without forcing it, to understand what Brower had meant when he said that the map required a particular quality of attention. The attention was not just to the geographic facts, but to the way those facts were lived and understood by the people who inhabited the place. It was the attention to what mattered, to what deserved to be remembered, to what would allow the person who eventually read this map to understand not just where things were, but why they were there and what they meant. And if your own breathing is slowing now, if the map and the vellum and the quiet in room are settling gently over your thoughts the way the evening settles over the landscape, then you are resting in exactly the right place. And the understanding, like all the best understandings, is coming to you in its own on time, without any effort at all. The fire is low, the room is warm, and the map, patient as it has always been, is waiting. The monastery on the hillside was exactly as Brower had described it, and yet it was not. The garden walls were still there, the eastern portion built of stone, that was visibly older than the rest of the structure. The moss growing in the same pattern that age and moisture and the particular quality of the hillside light had produced over centuries. The medicinal plants in the garden were still there, though some of them were different from the ones Brower had noted, and some of the same ones had been planted in different locations. The brothers who tended the garden were different too. Younger men, or at least men who had not been alive when Brower had visited, and yet they moved through the rows of plants with the same unhurried familiarity that he had observed, the same gentle economy of movement that suggested a long and intimate acquaintance with the place and its needs. The prior, the prior, a man whose face carried the particular quality of someone who had spent many years in conversation with people who came seeking something, healing, guidance, a place to rest for a while. Listened to Anna's questions about the monastery and its history, with a patience that was not merely polite, but was rooted in something deeper, a genuine willingness to share what he knew. He spoke of the garden and its history, of the stonework in the eastern wall, of the older foundations that had been uncovered during repairs made several decades before and incorporated back into the structure in a way that honored the older work without trying to disguise it. He spoke in a voice that was soft and even, and he spoke without hurry, as if he understood that the listener needed time to receive the information and incorporate it into whatever framework they had brought with them. He told her that the monastery had changed hands several times over the centuries, that the religious orders that had occupied it had been different, that the political authorities above them had changed, but that the garden had remained, and the work of tending it had continued, and the brothers who came to live there had always found a way to continue the work, no matter what else had changed around it. She spent the afternoon at the monastery, walking the paths of the garden, making small sketches in her notebook, asking the occasional question, and then listening to the answer with, with the full attention she had learned to bring to everything in Brauer's studio. So soon? She did not mention the map directly, but she let the questions she asked move in the direction of what the map would need to know about this place. And the prior, who was evidently a man accustomed to reading between the lines, answered in a way that was both honest and complete, without ever needing to be told what the information was for. When she left, as the afternoon afternoon light was beginning the long slow turn toward evening, the prior walked with her to the gate and said something that she would remember for the rest of her life, something that she would come back to mentally in the quiet hours of many subsequent evenings. He said that places like this one, places that had held their essential character through centuries of change, were like the stones in the garden wall. They had been shaped by older hands, and they had been placed in their positions with a particular intention and they had remained in those positions through all the rearrangements that had happened above them and around them. They did not resist the changes, exactly, but they did not disappear into them either. They remained, and they continued to hold the shape of the place, even when the authorities and nemesis and the administration arrangements above them had changed beyond recognition. On the road to the market town, she stopped this at the house near the curve, in the road that Brauer had written about, the curve that avoided the low-lying area kept waterlogged by the underground spring. A man was working in the garden behind the house, and when she approached and asked about the spring and the reason for the curve, he wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at her with the same direct, unguarded attention that the prior had given her. He told her that the spring had been known in the family for as long as anyone could remember, that his grandfather had told him about it, and his grandfather's grandfather before him, and that no one had ever been able to find the exact source of it because it came up from somewhere deep, and the water moved under the ground ways that no one could entirely trace. He said that the road had curved the way it had for generations, and that the people who used the road knew that the direct line was not the right line, and that those who tried to use the direct line had found their wheels stuck in the mud, and their animals tired, and their journeys prolonged beyond what was necessary. He said these things without any particular emotion, simply as a description of the way the world was. And yet, there was something in the steadiness of his certainty that felt like a kind of continuity, thread that ran back through the generations, and connected him to the people who had made the original decision about the road's path. The first village she reached in the southeastern territory was a small place clustered around a stone church, whose tower was visible from the road for a considerable distance before the village itself came into view. She stopped there as the afternoon light was beginning to soften, and she asked at the first house she came to, the inn near the church, for directions to the sites Brauer had mentioned in his notes: the monastery on the hillside with the ancient garden, the road that curved because of the underground spring, the small market town that met on the third Friday of each month. The innkeeper, a woman whose face showed the accumulated years of work in the same place, listened to Anna's questions with a patience that was not quite patience, but was close to it. And then she nodded slowly and began to describe the route, using local names for places that did not appear on any official map and referring to landmarks whose usefulness had been established by generations of local use. She spoke a mixture of languages in the effortless way of someone who had grown up in a border region where the boundaries between tongues were porous and the practical necessity of understanding each other had long ago produced a kind of bilingual fluency that required no formal study. She spent the night at the inn in a room above the common area, where the floorboards creaked softly underfoot, and the light from the lamps below came up through the gaps in a series of wavering amber lines that moved as the people below moved. In the morning, she rose early and set out on the road the innkeeper had described, walking through the mist that had settled in the valley and not yet lifted, moving steadily toward the hillside where the monastery stood. The journey was not difficult, but it was not easy either, and the physical effort of walking through the countryside, the attention required to follow the path described by the innkeeper, the particular quality of the light and the air, and the sound of distant water. All of this, all is accumulated in her mind and body in a way that was different from reading about the same places in Brauer's notes, and different from copying his map in the studio. She was beginning, slowly, and without forcing it, to understand something of what he had meant when he said that the map required a particular quality of attention. And if your own steps are slowing now, if the road and the mist and the hillside monastery are settling gently over your thoughts the way the mist itself settles over the valley floor, then you have reached, without any effort at all, the right pace for this journey. The path is clear, the light is soft, and the monastery on the hill is waiting, patient as everything else in this story, for whoever is willing to walk slowly enough to find it. Brauer died in the early spring of the following year, on a morning when the frost was still on the cobblestones outside, but the light had already acquired the particular quality that belongs to March, a softness and a lateral warmth that is not quite the warmth of full spring, but is no longer the flat gray light of winter either. He had not been unwell in any dramatic or sudden sense. He had been for several months moving more slowly through the studio, tiring earlier in the evenings, occasionally setting down his pen in the middle of a session and sitting for a while with his hands folded on the table before him, looking at the work in a way that was different from his usual manner of looking, less analytical, more simply present, as if he were keeping company with the thing rather than assessing it. Anna had noticed this, without remarking on it, in the way she had learned to notice things in that room, storing the observation quietly and allowing it to mean whatever it needed to mean without forcing it into the shape of a conclusion. The last evening she had seen him working, he had been at the great map, not drawing, but reading the margin notes he had accumulated over the years, the tiny, careful annotations that filled the borders of the vellum with references and measurements, and the occasional brief description of a place that could not be entirely captured by the symbols available in the cartographic vocabulary. He had been reading them with the lamp held close, moving it slowly along the edge of the map. And she had the impression, watching him from the doorway, before he noticed her presence, of someone rereading a letter received long ago, not searching for new information, but simply renewing acquaintance with something already known and valued. He had looked up when she entered, nodded once in his customary way, and said that she should go home, that the evening was cold, and the work would be there in the morning. She had gone, and that had been the last ordinary thing between them. The landlady found him the next morning, seated at the smaller table near the window with his hands in his lap and his eyes closed, in a posture so close to sleep that she stood in the doorway for a full minute before understanding that it was not sleep. The studio was exactly as it always was. The instruments in their case, the commissioned work on the main table in its proper order, the reference materials on their shelves. The great map was rolled and wrapped in its linen, and tied with its bow, and replaced on the lower shelf. The lamp had been extinguished. The candle near the window had burned entirely down, and the wax had pooled and set in a small flat disk around the base of the holder. Everything was in its place, and everything was very still. Anna arrived at the studio that morning at her usual hour, unaware of what had happened. The landlady met her at the door and told her in a few quiet sentences, and Anna stood on the threshold for a moment, with her hand still on the door frame, feeling the cold of the morning air on her back, and the warmer air of the building's interior on her face. She did not go into the studio immediately. She sat for a while in the small parlor on the ground floor that she had never previously had occasion to use, in a chair whose cushion was faded with age, looking at the pattern of the floorboards while the landlady moved around the building with the particular soft efficiency of a person managing practical necessities in the presence of loss. After some time, she could not have said how long, she went upstairs. Anna left the and walked out into the afternoon light, which was soft and low, and casting long shadows across the street. She did not look back. She did not need to. The map was where it belonged, and it would be there when she returned, and it would be there for whoever else might come and might need to see it. She walked through the city, past the buildings and the shops, and the people going about their ordinary business, and she felt in herself a quiet sense of completion, not the dramatic completion of a story that had reached its climax, but the quiet completion of work that had been done well, work that had been done with the right attention, work that had been done with the understanding that some things matter and deserve to be remembered, even if the world above them has changed beyond recognition. The evening was soft, and the light was fading, slowly, the way all evenings fade, the way all days end, the way all work eventually comes to its conclusion. Time passed, the seasons turned, the city changed as cities do, and the territory depicted on the map continued to change as territories do, as political realities do, as the names of places do. The map remained in the archive, unrolled occasionally by researchers and students, by people who needed to understand the territory as it had been. as it had been understood by the people who had lived there, as it had been recorded in the careful lines and the marginal notes that Brauer had written and Anna had completed. It was consulted, studied, copied, and returned to its shelf. And it remained, patient as everything else. In this story, patient as the archive itself, patient as the centuries that had passed since the great cartographic traditions had begun, patient as the long, slow turning of the world. The candle is low now, the room is quiet and still. The story has done its work. If your eyes are heavy, if your breathing is slow, if you are drifting gently toward the space between waking and sleep, that is exactly the right place to be. The map is on the shelf, the archive is quiet, and the sound of footsteps, f- the footsteps of Anna walking away from the archive, the footsteps of the archivist returning the map to its place, the footsteps of whoever will come after and will retrieve the map and will study it and will understand. All of those footsteps are fading now, settling into the quiet, becoming part of the dust that settles in the archive, becoming part of the silence that holds the map and the stories and the centuries within it. Rest now. The candle is low. The story has done its work. And the final image, the single calm image that closes this story, is the door of the archive, closing softly, the latch settling into place, the dust settling on the floor, the footsteps fading into the quiet, and the map, patient and complete, waiting on its shelf for whoever will come after, and will need to see it, will need to understand, will need to remember. She began the work in the late autumn, when the light in the studio had acquired the particular quality that belongs to that season, la, and lateral, casting long shadows across the table and revealing the texture of the vellum in a way that the stronger light of summer did not. She had prepared herself for the work in the weeks following her return from the journey, grinding pigments and stretching vellum for the smaller exercises, reacquainting her hand with the control of pressure and speed that produced a line of consistent weight. She had read through the folios again, not searching for new information, but allowing the material to settle into her memory, to become part of the background, understanding that would guide her hand when she set the pen to the empty quarter. She had sat with the map for hours, simply looking at it, moving her eyes across the completed portions, allowing herself to become familiar again with Brower's hand, his choices, his way of seeing the world. The first line she drew was not a major feature of the territory. It was not a river or a road or a coastline. It was a small footpath in the upper portion of the southeastern quarter, a path that connected two small villages and appeared on no official map, a path that Brower had mentioned in one of his marginal notes as a route that local farmers used to reach their fields on the far side of the low hills. She drew it carefully, with the same attention she would have given to a major river, and as she drew it, she felt something in her understanding of the work shift, just slightly, the way a weight shifts when it is being carefully balanced and the center of gravity is finally found. The footpath was not necessary for the map to function as a geographic document. It was not necessary for anyone to navigate the territory using the map, but it was necessary for the map to be what Brower had intended it to be, a record of what mattered, a record of the texture of the place, a record of the attention that had been given to it over the years. The work proceeded slowly, as all good work in the studio had always proceeded. She drew the rivers first, following the courses that Brower had described in his notes and that she had seen with her own eyes on her journey, tracing the long, unhurried curves from the hill country down through the valleys to the flat plain. She drew the roads, the major thoroughfares, and the smaller routes, noting where they curved to avoid the low-lying areas, and where they followed the ridges, and where they crossed the rivers at the stone bridges that had been built generations before. She drew the settlements, the large towns, and the small villages, placing them with the precision that the cartographic tradition demanded, but also with the understanding that the map was not just a representation of where things were, but of what they meant to the people who lived there. As she worked, she found herself writing the marginal notes that Brauer had written, the careful descriptions of things that could not be fully expressed in the map's symbolic vocabulary. She wrote about the monastery on the hillside and the ancient garden, about the underground spring that no one had ever pinpointed, about the market town that met on the third Friday of the month. She wrote about the old names that people still used in their everyday speech, about the way the borders were not lines but transitions, about the continuity of practices and memories that had been tested by time and found to be useful. She wrote in Brauer's hand, or as close to it as she could manage, the neat, careful script that filled the borders of the vellum with references and measurements and descriptions. She wrote with the understanding that these notes were not secondary to the map, that they were not embellishments or commentary, but that they were the essential accompaniment to the lines, the words that carried what the symbols could not convey. She did not unroll the map immediately. It sat on the table in her small room above the studio for 3 days, still wrapped in its linen, still tied with the bow that Brauer's hands had last touched, while she attended to the practical matters that his death required, speaking with the landlady, writing to the family members whose addresses she found in the correspondence files, arranging for the disposition of the commissioned work in progress, which was collected by the patron's representative at the end of the week, without any acknowledgement of the circumstances beyond a brief and not unkind expression of condolence. These tasks occupied her hands and a portion of her mind, and the rest of her mind remained in the studio, moving quietly around the edges of what had happened, not yet ready to examine it directly, but not willing to look entirely away either. She slept lightly, and in the mornings, the linen wrapped roll on the table was the first thing she saw when the light came through the curtain. On the fourth morning, she rose earlier than usual, before the light had fully established itself, and carried the map down to the studio. She cleared the main table entirely, moving the remaining reference materials to the side shelf, and laid the linen-wrapped roll in the center of the cleared surface. She untied the bow with deliberate slowness, folding the linen back, as Brauer had done. On the evening, he first showed her the map, and weighted the corners with the river stones. Then she brought the lamp close and sat down and began to read. She had seen the map before, of course, several times over the preceding months, always in Brauer's presence, always with his quiet commentary providing a frame for what she was looking at. But reading it alone, in the early morning, with the lamp held at an angle that cast the surface into a slight relief, and revealed the texture of the vellum beneath the ink, was an entirely different experience. Without his voice in the room, the map spoke more directly, and what it said was richer and more complex than she had understood when she was receiving it secondhand. The density of information she had admired before now revealed itself as something more than professional thoroughness. The choices Brauer had made, what to include, how to render it, what symbols to use, for which features, where to place the marginal notes, and what to put in them, were not merely cartographic decisions. They were a continuous series of judgments about what mattered, about what deserved to be remembered, about what the person who eventually read this map would need to know in order to truly understand the place it depicted. She spent the first morning simply looking at the completed portions, reacquainting herself with the territory without any specific analytical purpose. She followed the rivers from their origins in the Hatched Hill country of the northern section, down through the widening valleys, to the flat river plain of the south, no- noticing how the density of settlement increased as the land leveled out and the soil deepened, how the roads thickened into a network near the larger towns, and then thinned again as they moved into the forest country to the east. She read the marginal notes, one by one, slowly, moving the lamp along the border of the vellum. Many of them were straightforward references, a surveyor's name, a measurement and date, the title of an account from which a particular piece of information had been taken, but others were different in character. Brief, careful descriptions of things that could not be fully expressed in the map's symbolic vocabulary, set down in a prose so spare and precise that each one carried the quality of a long observation compressed into its essential truth. There is a particular quality of light that belongs to the afternoons of late autumn, when the sun has begun its long, slow descent toward the horizon, and the shadows stretch across the landscape with a deliberation that is almost visible to the eye. It was in this light that Anna found herself one afternoon, sitting at the table in the inn where she had stopped for the night, the map unrolled and weighted at its corners, the folios open beside it, and the notebook in which she had accumulated her observations from the journey spread out before her. She had been traveling for nearly 3 weeks, moving through the southeast territory, with no deadline beyond the general understanding that she would return to the city when the journey felt complete. And now, in the quiet of the inn's common room, with the fire low and the other travelers gone to their rooms, and the only sound the occasional crackle of the wood in the hearth, she began to see something that she had not seen clearly before. The borders on the map, she realized, were not the same thing as the boundaries that people in the territory actually recognized and used. The political borders that Brower had drawn, based on the official documents and administrative records and treaties negotiated in distant cities, were clean, straight lines that cut across the landscape in a way that made sense on paper, but did not align with the way the people who lived there moved through the world. The actual boundaries, the ones that mattered in daily life, were different. They followed the rivers and the ridges and the old roads. They respected the watersheds and the agricultural patterns and the historical settlements. They moved in the direction of the natural features of the land rather than across them. And they were drawn in the people's minds and practices with a flexibility that official documents did not permit. A border on a treaty was a line that had to be consistent and unambiguous. A border in the territory was a transition zone, a place where one set of practices gradually gave way to another, where the language shifted, where the names of places changed, where the style of the buildings altered in a way that was visible but not sharp. She thought about this distinction, and she thought about the people she had met along the way. The innkeeper who spoke a mixture of languages, the prior who had told her about the stones in the garden wall, the man who knew about the underground spring, the woman who had been coming to the market for 40 years. She thought about the way they spoke of their places, of their histories, of their relationships to the land and to each other. They did not speak in the language of official borders. They spoke in the language of the land itself, in the language of continuity and memory and the long, slow accretion of practices that had been tested by time and found to be useful. Their borders were not lines, but patterns, not boundaries, but transitions, not declarations, but understandings that had been accumulated over generations and were transmitted through the ordinary business of living rather than through documents. The cartographic tradition she had learned in Brauer's studio had grown from the desire to make things precise, to render the world in a form that could be copied and distributed and used by people who had never been to the places being depicted. This was a valuable and necessary thing, and it was the work that had occupied Brauer's life and that now occupied hers. But the precision of the map was not the same thing as the truth of the place. The map could capture the major features, the rivers and the roads and the settlements, and it could do so with a remarkable degree of accuracy, but it could not capture the full texture of the place. The way that certain hours, the way the people who lived there understood their relationship to the land and to each other, the way the old names persisted in the everyday speech even after they had disappeared from the official documents. The map was a representation, not the thing itself. The realization came quietly, without any dramatic moment of understanding, the way understanding often comes in the early morning hours when the mind is soft and the boundaries between thought and feeling are not as sharp as they are during the day. Anna was sitting at the table in her room. In the city, the map unrolled before her. The folios opened beside it. The notebook of her observations spread out across the surface of the table. She had returned from her journey 3 weeks before, and the days had been occupied with the ordinary work of the studio, the commission work, the copying of the reference maps, and the stretching of vellum for future projects. But in the evenings, after the work was complete, and the lamp had been lit, and the city outside had settled into its nighttime quiet, she had returned again and again to the map, to the empty southeastern quarter, to the question of what she needed to do to complete it. She had been thinking about the map as a task of filling in the blanks, of taking the information in the folios and transferring it to the vellum, of rendering the features of the territory in the cartographic language that Brauer had taught her. She had been thinking about it as a technical problem, a matter of correct applications and the correct application of the symbols and conventions of the craft. But as she sat there in the lamplight, looking at the empty quarter and the notes and the sketches from her journey, she began to see that the map was not simply a geographic document. It was something more, and perhaps something less. It was a record of attention. It was a record of a particular person's way of seeing the world, of what he had chosen to notice, of what he had considered worth preserving. The lines on the map were not just representations of the physical features of the land. They were expressions of judgment, of value, of the kind of attention that Brauer had brought to the territory over the years of his work on it. The map was a portrait, she realized. Not a portrait of a person, but a portrait of a place, rendered in the language of cartography. And like any portrait, it was not a neutral representation. It was an interpretation, a selection of what was considered essential from among the infinite details that made up the actual place. Brauer had spent more than 12 years on this map, and those 12 years had overlapped with a period of significant political change in the territory he was depicting. He had watched the borders shift, the administrative arrangements change, the names of places altered. He had watched the political reality that the map was intended to document begin to dissolve, and he had continued to work on it slowly and deliberately, gathering information, making notes, drawing the portions that he had completed with a care that did not diminish despite the changing circumstances above it. She understood now, with a clarity that was not intellectual, but was more like a kind of recognition, why he had not completed the map. It was not because the information was insufficient. It was because the act of completing it felt, to him, like something that required a particular relationship to the place and to the people who had lived there. He had understood that the map would outlast the political reality it depicted, that it would become, in time, a record of a place that no longer existed in the way he had known it. And he had hesitated, not out of fear or uncertainty, but out of a kind of respect for the weight of that act. To complete the map was to make a claim about what deserved to be remembered, to say that the place was worth preserving in this form, even if the political reality above it had changed beyond recognition.